In 2010, I brought NASA's first black employees to the Smithsonian to talk to the public. As part of that project, we also put together a series of biographical videos. They were narrated by astronaut Mae Jemison. Here is one of those videos now.
During my elementary and high school years, I picked cotton.
Morgan Watson grew up in Louisiana.
We were out during the fall to pick cotton. We went during the summers to chop the cotton.
Laws kept blacks and whites separated.
There were white and colored, as they said, water fountains, separate restroom facilities. But that was the way of life, and you adapted to your environment.
Blacks were only allowed to hold certain jobs. Morgan wanted to rise above all of that, and he was lucky. He had what he called a greasy thumb.
I like to tinker with things, take them apart and put them back together. And I worked in a hardware store, and the white store owner saw my report card one day and saw that I had good grades in math and science and so forth, and he said, you probably would make a good engineer.
Morgan didn't know what an engineer was, so he went to the library to find out. He earned a scholarship to a black college.
When I came to Southern University, a freshman in 1961, the civil rights movement was just getting kicked off. There were other students participating in the city, and they had gotten arrested. So we marched downtown in protest of that.
In college, he studied to become an engineer, and he enrolled in the first computer class the university offered. Just think of what was happening during this time. Segregation's barriers were coming down. A university was offering its first computer class ever. And the President of the United States was challenging the nation to attempt a feat few thought possible.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Morgan Watson found himself in the middle of all of this. To use a phrase from the 60s, far out.
I knew what NASA was, and I knew about President Kennedy's idea of putting a man on the moon, but to think that I could work there.
And that's just what happened. In the fall of 1963, NASA had almost no African Americans in skilled jobs, but they wanted some. So the agency invited Morgan, along with his friends George Bordeaux, Tommy Dubon, Frank Williams, and 3 others from their school to come to a work-study program at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama.
Well, we were the first African-American engineers at NASA.
The newspapers at that time called Morgan and his friends social pioneers. Worried that the white students in their program would think that they were not qualified because they attended a black school.
We went out of our way to study late, to work hard, and do whatever it took to we felt that the whole image of black people were riding on us as professionals, and we couldn't fail. Failure was not an option for us.
In order to graduate, Morgan needed to take a math class, but it was only offered at an all-white college. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, wanted to keep the universities segregated.
The governor is adamant. He made a campaign promise to stand in the doorway himself to prevent the integration of the last all-white state university.
Morgan and one of his friends quietly enrolled in the class.
All we knew is we needed the class. And Governor Wallace or anybody else could try and stand in the door and stop us, but we needed that class.
After he graduated from college, Morgan continued to work in the space program.
I worked for Chrysler, which was one of the NASA contractors, and they made the booster capsule that took man to the moon, the very first stage of the moon rocket.
In the 1960s, NASA represented the future. The scientists and the engineers there were the best and the brightest, and Morgan Watson was one of them.
The space program certainly helped change the South by showing that there were black professionals who could do that. You proved the fact that people were available that could do it. It helped to break the walls down. It helped change people's perception of black people in the South.
Up next, the man who lived at Kennedy Space Center. Imagine if the government gave you a plot of land big enough for a town. Then imagine they took it away 2 generations later. What if you lived there when the town disappeared? Well, that's what happened to Theodis Ray.
There was a lot of history there, and there was a lot of black people doing things that I don't see written anywhere.
The place where Theodis Ray grew up was called Allenhurst. Today, you know it as this. This is the VAB at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. But it used to be a town founded by free black citizens in 1872.
Back then, blacks had a lot of property over there. There was a lot of industry over there.
The people who founded Allenhurst had been members of what was called the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. Like the soldiers you saw in that movie, Glory. The government gave them the land as a reward for helping in the fight for freedom. For the next 90 years, the people there were able to work for their own benefit and, for the first time ever, teach their children to read and write. In 1890, Butler Campbell and a neighbor built the Clifton Schoolhouse for their children. Here's how Theodis Ray remembers the town as a boy.
Don't get me wrong, blacks didn't own land out there, but they had the orange grove. Blacks did own a lot of orange grove, and plus they had businesses too. For instance, Andrew Gibson. Well, Andrew Gibson was one of the first blacks in Titusville to set up business. He set up what we might say today was the first little mini mall, because he set up a place that had a shoe shop, barber shop, a cafe, all these kind of things. There's nothing written today about it.
One of Theodis's neighbors was Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance anthropologist and playwright. She lived in a trailer there in the last years of her life. All of this black self-determination ended in 1963. In this letter, the NASA administrator requested that the government condemn Allenhurst and destroy it. NASA was going to the moon, and they needed land to build a bigger launch facility.
It wiped us out. You had these fishermen, that was their livelihood. Most of them didn't have education, and all they did was fish.
A lot of them ended up working as janitors at NASA. Theodis did too, until he joined the Marines and went to Vietnam.
When I came back out of the Marine Corps, I signed up with a company out of Texas, LTV. It's a technical company. I went from one contract to another into logistics.
He ended up running a NASA warehouse where he said you could get anything you needed, from a pencil to a missile component. He worked at NASA the rest of his career. All that's left of Allenhurst is the remains of the schoolhouse and a plaque, plus the memories of Theodis Ray. A few years ago, I went down to Florida to give a talk to NASA employees. Theodis was there. After we finished, all these young black NASA people came up to ask about Allenhurst. Where is it? We want to go see the plaque. I said, don't ask me. Mr. Ray is standing right over there. He grew up there. Go ask him. He'll be happy to show you. Theodis died in 2021. I've tried to do everything I can since then to keep this history alive in his honor. Next up, the man who took on the Klan. I want to talk to you about the bravest man I've ever met. He's also probably the most self-sacrificing person that I've ever met. He's a hero of the civil rights movement who you have probably never heard of. And to make all of this relevant, to give you all the background, we need to spend a little time talking about the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan seems really old-fashioned these days with the robes and the crosses. It seems like something from a million years ago, but it's really not. I'm not that old, and I remember my family driving down to Disney World and seeing this sign. I'm Jewish, and it scared the hell out of me. I can't imagine what it did to black people. We were going to Orlando. That's 45 minutes away from Cape Canaveral, where NASA shoots off its rockets. A while back, I led a discussion at the Smithsonian with astronauts Mae Jemison and Leland Melvin. These are two people who sat on top of rockets that shot them into space. We were talking, and they agreed that the most scared they've ever been? Driving at night around Cape Canaveral. The Ku Klux Klan is the reason why. Ben Green wrote a history about this part of Florida.
In Brevard County, the home of Cape Canaveral, going back to the 20s, they used to have Klan parades. They had a junior Klan for young people. They had elected officials, city commissioners, county commissioners.
In Orlando, a Klansman was the sheriff from 1948 to 1972.
Local businessmen joined the Klan, almost like joining the Rotary Club.
And the thing that made this so terrifying, remember, the Klan were terrorists.
Florida had the highest per capita rate of lynching of any southern state.
Terrorists were running this part of Florida. Now you know why they're trying to whitewash history in the Florida schools. So that's all background for this story about bravery. It's about someone else who was on that panel that day at the Smithsonian. This is Julius Montgomery. Everybody knows the name of the first black player in Major League Baseball. Most people can name the first person to integrate the University of Mississippi. But how many people can name the first technical professional ever hired at Cape Canaveral? And who can name the name of the man who integrated the Florida Institute of Technology? And how many Americans know that the same man did both? Julius Montgomery joined the space program in 1956. He was the first black man hired at Cape Canaveral as anything other than a janitor. But unlike Jackie Robinson, unlike the Little Rock Nine, who integrated Central High School a few weeks later, unlike Mae Jemison, as she waved and boarded the space shuttle, as Julius Montgomery walked to the entrance of Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, in the heart of country, there were no reporters. There was no one from the NAACP to offer support. Julius was completely alone. He reached the lab, swung open the door, and faced a room full of angry white men.
The first day I was there, nobody would shake my hand. I got to the last fellow. I said, "How are you? I'm Julius Montgomery." And, "Boy, you don't talk to a white man like that." I said, "Oh, forgive me, oh great white bastard." I really did say that. And he laughed, I laughed, and then we shook hands. And so I said, "Look, I'm part of the educational program to train you guys to act like people. You've been acting like rednecks all your life. So you need training, retraining." Go there and like that too much,
But Julius didn't stop at just integrating the space program. The Florida Institute of Technology started life as Brevard Engineering College. Classes met in a public junior high school. The college was run by Dr. Jerome P. Cooper, who worked with Julius at Cape Canaveral.
So he put up a notice. All those interested signed the paper he put up on the board. So I signed it, of course, put down Tuskegee.
Because that's where Julius went to college. But remember, this was country. A few days later, the county superintendent of schools was on the phone to Dr. Cooper.
He was told, "I'm sorry, but this fellow here is from Tuskegee, so he must be black. He cannot come to this classroom."
Dr. Cooper was desperate. If Julius didn't drop out, they would kick the college out into the street. He begged him, "Please drop out."
So I said, "Well, okay." After a short conversation, I said, "For the better good of everybody, I took my name off the list." So we became friends. He said, "As soon as I get my own buildings, you are welcome." And that was true, he did.
Florida Tech never forgot what Julius Montgomery did for them, how he saved the school from dying. They created an award in his name that they gave out every year. And then, a few days before Julius died, in 2020, they gave him an honorary doctorate. I give talks about Julius from time to time, and it's such an honor. There's a certain type of civil rights hero that we all know about, the people who protested and the sit-ins and the people who fought. People like Julius Montgomery are a different kind of hero. There are dozens of these people, especially at NASA, who serve the cause of equality just by showing up for work every day. I wrote a book about them. They had to be the best. They could not fail, and they did not fail. We need to remember their legacy. Up next, a man who is stronger than steel. As an engineer, Frank Crossley created metals that were stronger than steel, but much lighter. The irony is, doing that as a black man in the 1960s meant that he needed a fortitude that was stronger than steel, but with a touch that was much lighter. Frank Crossley grew up on the south side of Chicago. His father was a train porter. His mother worked in a button factory. During World War II, he entered a school that trained naval officers. He was the only black man in a class of 1,500. How do you feel about that situation?
My fear gene seems to be very weak.
In the early years, the U.S. Navy had black sailors. 25% of the Navy was black at the end of the Civil War, but then Jim Crow kicked in. Armies can segregate on land. Ours did. Navies can't, so they segregated by job category. For 80 years, black men were only allowed to be cooks and butlers for white officers. Frank was part of a program to test whether white men would take orders from black officers. He was put in charge of a crew that fueled and painted a ship bringing troops back home after the war. As that work began, he set something straight in his mind.
When I joined the Navy, I decided that if I heard the N-word and it was not directed to me, I would not take offense. I would only take offense if it was directed to me.
After the war, Frank went to the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he became the first black man in America to earn a PhD in metallurgical engineering. At about that time, President Kennedy signed an executive order that told companies and universities that they had to take affirmative action to wipe out racial segregation. Here's how that played out for Frank Crossley. IIT had a research institute, which had a department for metals research. Frank interviewed for 2 leadership jobs there.
I got offers from both supervisors who interviewed me. And then I learned that at the executive level, someone had turned down my employment.
Frank told the president of the college, John Retaliata, and while Frank was sitting there, Retaliata called to find out what was going on. Frank heard the person on the phone say it was because Frank was black.
And he said, "You can't do that because we are an equal opportunity employer." And that was the first time I'd heard the expression equal opportunity employer.
Frank was made the head of the IIT Metals Research Department. The most important thing he did there was develop something called Transage. It was lighter than steel, but you could heat it to 6 times the strength of steel. That's great for missiles. Konrad Dannenberg was one of the Germans who created the American space program.
Once you have ignited your rockets, your rocket combustion temperature is much higher than the melting temperature of steel. So even if you build your rocket from steel, it has a tendency to melt through and to have a big hole in your rocket engine.
But that didn't happen with the metal that Frank Crossley invented. It was also great for submarines because it wouldn't rust. Frank worked on the Trident submarine and also on the Poseidon. Now, I'm not going to lie, it wasn't all rosy. Twice, in the 1950s and in the 1970s, Frank said he got the same answer when he asked a supervisor about a promotion.
He said, "Yes, a promotion for you is long overdue, but because you are so advanced for a Negro, we thought you were content."
Frank Crossley always worked to stay as close to white people as the law and custom would allow. He did this for a reason. He was always mindful that he could prove by example the absurdity of superstitions about the other race. And finally, NASA's greatest pathbreaker on race. In the history of NASA, there is no one who did more to promote equal employment than this man, Clyde Foster. He got more black workers jobs, and he advanced the education of more black students. Here's part of his story. I want to give you a sense of what Clyde was up against in doing all of this. He was at NASA in Huntsville, Alabama. This was Alabama's governor.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The Ku Klux Klan used to stand out on the street in Huntsville and raise money. But on top of that, the Alabama Center was run by Nazis, and not in the way that we say that today. These men were actual Nazis. They built the missiles that Hitler used to destroy London. Clyde graduated from Alabama A&M University and got a job doing math at the Army base where they built missiles. They didn't have computers yet, so the math was done by hand. He got jobs for some of his fraternity brothers doing the same kind of work he was doing, but things really got started in 1963 when another town in Alabama exploded. Martin Luther King called Birmingham the most segregated city in America. In April, black children were recruited to march in protest. The police responded with attack dogs and fire hoses. When blacks began to fight back, it terrified the White House. A group of black celebrities went to see the president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. They told him that this was just the beginning. Cities were going to burn if more black people didn't get jobs. Kennedy had just gotten back from Alabama, where he found out that only 15 black people worked for the federal government in Birmingham. A few days later, the head of NASA was told by Vice President Johnson that the agency had to find a way to hire more Negroes in Huntsville. You know that scene in Hidden Figures when Octavia Spencer shows all the women how to use a computer?
We can do the work.
That is totally made up, but this is where they got the idea from. One thing NASA thought to do was buy a computer for Alabama A&M. Clyde heard about it.
And I said, maybe this is one way we can get more employees.
Obviously, he means black employees. He went to the Nazi who was running the center at the time and asked if he could be loaned out to the university
to establish a BS degree in computer sciences.
A class like this was something that no white university in Alabama offered. Think about that. In Alabama, black kids were getting training that white kids couldn't get. It worked. Dozens of African-American NASA employees started in this computer class. For all his success, Foster found that he could never advance at NASA. He wanted to be a supervisor, and he kept getting blocked. The center offered advanced training courses, but they only offered them in two places: hotel ballrooms and the white university, both places where black people weren't allowed to go.
You weren't allowed in public facilities.
It was a catch-22.
In order to advance, you got to satisfy the prerequisites for what the job called for, and they refused to train you.
So no black people got promotions. Clyde worked for years to get NASA to end that injustice too. He finally got them to establish a separate but equal advanced training program for blacks at Alabama A&M.
And they would import some instructors as far away as Nashville, Tennessee, and we would tell them what kind of courses we wanted to get some training in. And so NASA paid those individuals to come down and do that.
So all that is just part of Clyde's story. He went on to become one of the first elected black mayors in the South. He appointed one of the South's first black police chiefs. And he started a movement all over the South for black self-governance. I got invited down to Huntsville in 2020. Clyde's wife and his daughter asked me to talk about him when this young lady won a scholarship named in Clyde's honor. So many people were touched by Clyde Foster's work. We are all better for knowing him. If any or all of this is news to you, I have a book I want to suggest. It's the one behind me, We Could Not Fail, which I wrote along with Stephen Moss. There's a paperback version, and you can also get it in an audiobook form from Audible.